One of the strangest things people experience after a deep emotional connection is suddenly feeling someone's presence, even when there has been no communication at all. Out of nowhere, you start thinking about them intensely. Their name appears in your mind repeatedly. A strong emotional wave hits you unexpectedly. Sometimes you even feel emotional shifts you cannot logically explain. And many people dismiss these moments immediately because they cannot prove them scientifically in that exact moment. But emotional connection affects people far more deeply than most realize. See, when two people share genuine emotional attachment, their minds and emotions often become connected through repeated emotional experiences, memories, routines, and energy. The human brain naturally forms emotional associations. The more emotionally impactful someone becomes in your life, the more deeply they remain embedded inside your emotional world. That's why certain people suddenly appear in your thoughts so strongly without warning. Because emotional bonds do not always disappear simply because communication stopped. Sometimes your emotional awareness notices the connection before logic does. Now, this does not mean every random thought is some magical sign. Sometimes memory alone triggers emotions naturally. But many people notice something deeper happens when the connection was truly intense. You may suddenly feel emotional heaviness, curiosity, restlessness, warmth, or overwhelming thoughts about someone right before they reach out or reappear in your life. And that emotional experience feels difficult to ignore because it arrives so unexpectedly. One moment you are focused on your life normally. The next moment their energy feels emotionally present again. Their memory becomes unusually vivid. Their emotions almost feel close to you. And whether people describe this as intuition, emotional energy, subconscious connection, or emotional awareness, the experience itself is incredibly common after deep relationships because emotional attachment leaves psychological imprints. The brain remembers emotional significance very strongly, especially when someone affected your heart deeply. The conversations, the emotional comfort, the emotional intensity, the routines, the emotional safety, all of those experiences create neural and emotional patterns that stay active long after physical distance appears. And interestingly, emotional awareness often becomes stronger during silence. When constant communication disappears, your mind becomes more sensitive to emotional shifts. You notice thoughts more clearly. Emotional waves feel stronger because distractions decrease. And sometimes that awareness makes you feel emotionally connected to someone even before words are exchanged again. But here is what matters most. Emotional awareness becomes clearest when you are calm. Overthinking destroys intuition. Anxiety creates obsession. Fear creates emotional confusion. If your mind constantly chases signs every second, it becomes difficult to distinguish real emotional intuition from emotional desperation. But when you are emotionally grounded, peaceful, and connected to yourself, your emotional instincts often become surprisingly accurate because calmness sharpens awareness. And many people notice this pattern repeatedly. The moment they finally stop obsessing, relax emotionally, and reconnect with themselves, they suddenly feel someone's energy again very strongly. Then unexpectedly, the message arrives. The call happens. The person returns emotionally. Why? Because emotional connection often continues existing beneath silence even when ego, fear, distance, or circumstances interrupt communication temporarily. Still, the most important thing is not becoming consumed, trying to constantly sense someone thinking about you. That can easily become unhealthy emotional attachment. The true purpose of emotional awareness is understanding that deep connections leave emotional echoes inside both people. Real emotional bonds rarely disappear instantly, especially when the connection carried emotional depth, vulnerability, peace, or love. And sometimes the strongest sign someone is thinking about you is the sudden emotional feeling you cannot explain logically, but your heart recognizes immediately. One of the most powerful things silence does in relationships is reveal emotions people were too distracted to fully feel before. When constant communication exists, people often move through conversations automatically. Messages become routine. Attention becomes expected. Emotional presence becomes familiar. And without realizing it, both people can stop truly feeling the emotional impact of the connection itself. But silence changes that completely. Because the moment communication slows down or disappears, emotional awareness often becomes much stronger. Suddenly, there are no distractions covering the emotional space between two people. No constant texting, no daily reassurance, no emotional noise filling every moment. And in that silence, feelings that were buried under routine begin rising to the surface. That's why distance often makes people think more deeply about someone. Not because silence magically creates love that never existed, but because absence forces emotional reflection. It removes comfort, familiarity, and emotional access. And when someone can no longer casually experience your presence whenever they want, your emotional value often becomes clearer in their mind, because people notice things differently once they are missing. Your voice, your energy, your emotional support, your attention, the way you made them feel emotionally safe, understood, or peaceful. Those emotional experiences become louder inside silence because now there is space to actually feel their absence. And this is why constant chasing often weakens emotional impact after distance appears. The more someone fills every moment with emotional messages, explanations, and reactions, the less room there is for reflection. Silence never fully arrives, so emotional realization often never fully happens either. But when communication pauses naturally, the emotional connection starts echoing internally instead of externally. And that internal reflection becomes powerful because human emotions deepen in stillness. Think about how many times people suddenly miss someone most late at night, during quiet moments, while driving alone, or during emotional silence. Why? Because silence removes distractions and forces the heart to sit with what it truly feels. And if the connection carried genuine emotional depth, those feelings often become impossible to ignore during separation, especially when someone left a real emotional impact, a person who brought peace, comfort, emotional understanding, or emotional safety tends to remain in the mind much longer because emotional experiences create lasting psychological attachment. And once silence removes daily distractions, those emotional memories begin replaying naturally. That's why many people suddenly return emotionally after periods of silence. Not because manipulation happened, not because games were played, but because silence gave emotions room to breathe. It allowed someone to emotionally process what your presence actually meant in their life. Still, this only works naturally when silence comes from emotional maturity instead of emotional manipulation. There is a huge difference between peaceful distance and strategic emotional punishment. Healthy silence is not about trying to force someone to miss you. It's about allowing emotional clarity to happen without chasing, pressure, or desperation constantly interfering, because emotional truth becomes clearer in stillness. And interestingly, silence often affects both people at the same time. While one person is reflecting on the connection, the other may suddenly start feeling emotional waves, memories, or intuition more strongly too. Deep emotional bonds tend to leave emotional echoes that become louder once communication disappears. But the most important part is this. Silence also reconnects you with yourself. It removes emotional dependence little by little. It gives your nervous system room to calm down. It allows your mind to stop reacting constantly and start healing emotionally. And often, during that silence, both people finally begin understanding the emotional depth of the connection more clearly than they ever could while constantly speaking every day. One of the biggest misunderstandings people have about attraction is believing someone keeps thinking about you only because of physical appearance. Yes, appearance may create attention in the beginning. It may create curiosity, excitement, or temporary attraction. But what stays inside someone's mind long after the moment passes is rarely just appearances alone. People become unforgettable because of emotional impact. Because at the end of the day, human beings remember how someone made them feel emotionally far more deeply than surface-level attraction. A beautiful face may catch someone's attention for a moment, but emotional experiences are what create lasting mental attachment. Think about the people you still remember deeply in your own life. Usually it is not simply because they looked attractive. It is because of the emotional atmosphere they created around you. Maybe they made you feel peaceful during difficult times. Maybe they truly listened when no one else did. Maybe their presence felt safe, comforting, inspiring, calming, or emotionally healing. Those emotional experiences leave psychological imprints. And once someone emotionally associates you with feelings they struggle to find elsewhere, your presence stays alive in their mind much longer than you realize. That's why certain people continue thinking about someone months or even years later. Not because they forgot how someone looked, but because they never forgot how emotionally different they felt around that person. Peace is remembered. Emotional safety is remembered. Genuine understanding is remembered. Real emotional connection is remembered. Especially in a world where many relationships become emotionally shallow, temporary, or surface level. When someone experiences a connection that feels emotionally grounding or emotionally meaningful, the mind naturally returns to it repeatedly because emotional depth creates emotional attachment. This is why chasing attention rarely works long term. When someone constantly tries to impress through appearances, jealousy, validation, or emotional games, the connection often stays superficial emotionally. But when someone creates genuine emotional impact through authenticity, calmness, confidence, kindness, emotional intelligence, and presence, the bond reaches much deeper levels psychologically. And deep emotional experiences are difficult to replace. That's why people often suddenly think about someone during emotional moments in life, during stress, during loneliness, during silence, during moments when they need emotional comfort or peace. The mind naturally returns to people associated with emotional safety and emotional grounding, not because those people were perfect, but because they felt emotionally meaningful. And interestingly, people often do not fully recognize that emotional value until distance appears. While the connection exists daily, familiarity can hide appreciation. But once someone's presence disappears, the emotional difference becomes clearer. Suddenly they realize what your energy actually brought into their life emotionally. That's when memories intensify. That's when your voice, your calmness, your support, your emotional warmth start replaying in their mind unexpectedly. Because emotional memory is powerful. The brain naturally revisits experiences connected to strong emotional feelings, especially feelings connected to comfort and emotional peace. This is why becoming emotionally grounded matters far more than trying to become perfect for someone. Your emotional energy leaves a stronger imprint than you realize. The way you carry yourself, the way people feel around you, the emotional environment you create around your presence, those things stay inside people much longer than temporary attraction alone. Because eventually excitement's Sophia-level attraction fades. But emotional impact echoes inside the heart for a very long time, and sometimes the reason someone keeps thinking about you constantly is not because you were the most perfect person they ever met, but because you made them feel something emotionally real they cannot easily find again anywhere else. One of the biggest reasons people fail to realize your emotional value is because they become too accustomed to your constant presence. When your attention, energy, love, and emotional availability are always there, no matter how little effort someone gives in return, your presence slowly starts feeling guaranteed instead of appreciated. And unfortunately, human beings often recognize value more clearly once they experience absence. That's why the moment you stop chasing, something emotionally shifts, because constant emotional availability removes tension. If someone knows they can always access your attention whenever they want, no matter how distant, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable they become, they never fully experience what life feels like without you emotionally present. Your messages keep filling the silence. Your effort keeps carrying the connection. Your emotional energy keeps making them feel comfortable even while they slowly drift away emotionally. But once you pull your energy back, the emotional dynamic changes completely. Suddenly, the silence becomes noticeable. Your attention is no longer constantly available. Your emotional presence is no longer guaranteed. And for the first time, they are left alone with the emotional space your absence creates. That's when reflection often begins, see. People rarely miss what still feels fully accessible every second. But when emotional access disappears, the mind naturally starts revisiting what used to be there. Your voice, your support, your consistency, your warmth, the emotional comfort your presence created. All those things become louder emotionally once they are no longer constantly available. And this is where many people make the mistake of chasing harder instead of stepping back. The moment they feel someone becoming distant, fear takes over. They text more, call more, explain more, try harder. They believe increasing effort will somehow stop emotional distance from growing. But emotionally constant chasing often prevents someone from fully feeling your absence at all, because your energy never truly leaves. And without absence, emotional realization often stays weak. That's why silence and emotional distance can become surprisingly powerful. Not because you are playing games or trying to manipulate someone emotionally, but because stepping back finally allows the other person to emotionally process the connection without constant emotional noise filling the space. And something interesting happens during that silence. People start noticing the emotional difference. They realize how much calmer life felt with your presence, how comforting your energy was, how emotionally supported they felt around you, how much emotional stability you brought into their world. Things they once overlooked suddenly become emotionally visible, because now there is contrast between having you emotionally present and not having you there anymore. But this only works when your energy shift is genuine, not fake silence while secretly obsessing over every outcome. Real emotional power comes when you truly begin reconnecting with yourself again. Your own peace, your own confidence, your own life outside the relationship. Because that internal shift changes your emotional presence naturally. You stop acting from fear. You stop desperately needing constant validation. You stop trying to force someone to choose you. And that emotional independence becomes magnetic because it feels emotionally grounded instead of emotionally dependent, especially to someone who became used to your constant pursuit. Because now, for the first time, they feel the emotional space your absence created. And in that space, memories become stronger, emotional awareness becomes clearer, your value becomes more visible internally. Not because you forced them to think about you, but because your absence finally gave them room to truly feel what your presence meant all along. And sometimes, the moment you stop chasing someone emotionally is the exact moment they finally begin chasing the feeling they lost when your energy disappeared from their life. One of the biggest reasons people struggle trusting their intuition is because their mind is too full of fear, anxiety, and overthinking to hear themselves clearly. When emotions become intense, the mind starts searching obsessively for answers. Every message gets analyzed. Every silence feels personal. Every small sign becomes emotionally magnified. And slowly confusion replaces clarity because overthinking creates emotional noise. And emotional noise disconnects you from your natural intuition. See, intuition does not usually scream. It is subtle, calm, quiet. It appears through emotional awareness, inner knowing, emotional shifts, patterns, and feelings that arrive naturally without force. But when someone is emotionally anxious or desperately seeking reassurance, the mind starts creating stories out of fear instead of recognizing emotional truth clearly. That's why people often misread situations when emotionally overwhelmed. Fear makes them assume rejection immediately. Anxiety makes them obsess over signs constantly. Emotional attachment makes them confuse desperation with intuition. And in that emotional chaos, it becomes difficult to recognize what is actually real. But something changes the moment your mind becomes calmer. The less emotionally reactive you become, the sharper your emotional awareness starts feeling. Suddenly, you begin noticing patterns more clearly. You sense emotional shifts without forcing them. You recognize changes in energy, behavior, timing, and emotional connection naturally because your nervous system is no longer trapped inside panic mode. That calmness strengthens intuition. Think about how often clarity appears after emotional intensity settles down. Sometimes people spend weeks obsessing over a situation without understanding anything clearly. Then one peaceful moment arrives, and suddenly everything emotionally makes sense. Why? Because emotional calmness removes mental distortion, and intuition works best inside stillness. That's why silence becomes powerful not only in relationships, but inside yourself. The quieter your emotional world becomes, the more sensitive you become to emotional truth. You stop reacting impulsively to every fear-based thought. You stop searching desperately for constant validation. Instead, you begin feeling emotionally grounded enough to observe situations with greater awareness. And this is often when people suddenly feel someone thinking about them more strongly, not because they became obsessed, but because they finally became calm enough to notice emotional connection without fear drowning everything out. Sometimes intuition appears through sudden emotional waves, unexpected thoughts, strong dreams, emotional shifts that arrive without logical triggers, or moments where someone's energy feels emotionally present before communication even happens. Now, that does not mean every feeling should automatically be treated as absolute truth. Emotional awareness still requires balance and emotional maturity. But many people ignore their own instincts entirely because they have become so disconnected from inner calmness that they no longer trust themselves. And overthinking is usually the reason, because overthinking constantly pulls your attention outward. It keeps you focused on controlling outcomes, predicting behavior, and seeking certainty every second. But intuition flows inward. It becomes strongest when your mind stops forcing answers and allows emotional awareness to emerge naturally. That's why healing emotionally matters so much. The more peaceful you become internally, the easier it becomes to recognize genuine emotional patterns instead of reacting only from fear. You begin understanding the difference between anxiety and intuition, between obsession and emotional awareness, between desperation and genuine inner knowing. And that emotional clarity changes relationships completely. Because now you stop chasing signs obsessively. You stop forcing emotional outcomes. You stop abandoning your peace trying to decode every tiny detail. Instead, you become emotionally centered within yourself. And often, the moment your mind finally becomes quiet enough is the exact moment your intuition starts revealing emotional truths your anxious thoughts were too loud to let you hear before. One of the biggest reasons people struggle emotionally in relationships is because they become disconnected from themselves while trying to hold on to someone else. Their mood depends on messages. Their peace depends on attention. Their confidence depends on validation. And slowly, their emotional world begins revolving entirely around another person's behavior. But real emotional power begins the moment you reconnect with yourself again. Because the strongest connections are not built through desperation, chasing, or emotional dependence. They are built through emotional alignment, through becoming emotionally grounded within your own life, your own peace, and your own self-worth first. And that energy changes everything. See, when someone is emotionally disconnected from themselves, they naturally operate from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of losing the connection. That fear creates emotional pressure, overthinking, insecurity, and constant emotional attachment to outcomes. But emotionally aligned people feel different. They still love deeply. They still care deeply. but they are not emotionally collapsing every time someone pulls away temporarily. Their identity remains stable. Their peace remains grounded. Their emotional energy no longer depends entirely on external validation. And that emotional stability becomes magnetic, because people naturally feel safer around grounded energy than desperate energy. Calmness creates comfort. Confidence creates attraction. Emotional peace creates emotional curiosity. And ironically, the less emotionally dependent you become, the more people often feel drawn toward your presence naturally. Why? Because emotionally aligned people stop forcing connection. They stop trying to control every outcome. They stop abandoning themselves trying to hold on to love. Instead, they begin focusing on their own healing, growth, routines, confidence, emotional health, and inner peace. And that internal transformation changes the emotional atmosphere around them completely. Suddenly, their presence feels lighter, more peaceful, more attractive, more emotionally secure. And people notice that shift immediately, especially someone who once experienced your energy from a place of fear, chasing, or emotional dependence. Now they are seeing someone calmer, someone emotionally grounded, someone whose happiness no longer disappears every time attention changes. That creates emotional contrast, because emotional alignment creates self-respect, and self-respect changes the way people experience you. Think about it carefully. The people who leave the strongest emotional impact are usually not the ones desperately begging to be loved. They are the ones who feel emotionally whole within themselves, the ones whose presence feels peaceful, authentic, confident, and emotionally balanced. That energy leaves lasting impressions. And this is why emotional alignment matters more than trying to make someone think about you constantly. The more connected you become to yourself, the more naturally your energy affects others. Not through manipulation, not through games, but through authenticity, because emotionally healthy energy feels rare, especially in relationships filled with anxiety, emotional inconsistency, and validation seeking. A person who genuinely loves themselves, respects their peace, and remains emotionally centered creates a completely different emotional experience for others. And interestingly, many people only begin fully appreciating your energy once you stop emotionally chasing them and start emotionally choosing yourself again. That's when they feel the shift. That's when they sense your emotional absence more deeply. That's when your confidence, peace, and emotional independence become impossible to ignore. But the greatest reward of emotional alignment is not getting someone's attention back. It's getting your own life back. Because once you become emotionally grounded within yourself, relationships stop controlling your emotional stability. Love becomes something beautiful you share, not something you desperately need to survive emotionally. And sometimes, the moment you finally stop searching for validation outside yourself is the exact moment your energy becomes strong enough for people to feel your presence, even in complete silence.